Hello, my name is Emma Cieslik. Today's date is Monday, April 1st, 2019. I'm interviewing Dr. Jon Hendrix on the Ball State campus as part of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project. Thank you, Dr. Hendrix, for agreeing to participate in this effort, which we're conducting during this, the Honors College's 60th anniversary year. I'd like to begin by asking you where and when you were born.
Passaic, New Jersey, 5438.
Yes. Were there any influential figures in your early life, such as a mentor, teacher, or parent?
In my early life, I had a great mentor teacher at Ball State, at Indiana State University in Terre Haute, Dr. Bill Hopp. He was not only a mentor to me, he was a surrogate father, since my mother and father were separated when I was 5 and I never lived with my father. So Bill was a great man and somebody that I emulated later on in life. I didn't really have any idea that I was going to go into teaching at the college level, but I ended up that way for several years.
Where did you go to elementary and middle school?
Went to elementary school in a little town of Rochdale, Indiana. And I mean, it is a little town. The entire school, K through 12, had about 800 students in it. So the kindergarten and first grade were fused, as I remember, so that I had some older individuals that were in there that were really good bullies. I mean, you know, just really nice people.
Were you involved in any extracurriculars?
And when I was in the college level, yes, no sports, but always head games. I was head of the chess club, head of the euchre club, and a few of those things.
Yes. Did you grow up in New Jersey? I know you had mentioned going to
5 years there. And then when Mother and Dad were separated, she came back to Indiana, and Dad was out in Boston. He set up his factory in Passaic, New Jersey, and then moved all that factory on up into Boston, and finally then on up to Melford, New Hampshire. Hendrix Wire and Cable Corporation. His cable is all over the world.
Yes. In high school, you went to Greencastle High School.
Yes.
Were you involved in any activities there?
All the clubs, but none of the sports.
Yes.
Reason for that. At a very early age, in fact 5 years of age, I had to have a steel plate put in my left ankle. I had osteomyelitis, which is an infection in the bone that eats away the bone, and they had to take that whole ankle joint out so that I wouldn't walk with a limp and I'd still be able to jitterbug, which I still can, even at my tender age of 80. The joint still works well, as do the artificial knees. The bionic man.
Yes. Were you involved in any specific educations of interest in elementary or middle school? Did you find any really fascinating?
I always was a scientist. Science always intrigued me, and life sciences more than the physical sciences. But I mean, I was bringing home bugs when I was 5, you know, and catching caterpillars and the whole bit, and always curious about what was going on. I could live in the woods. In fact, I still have 38 acres of woods over in Putnam County, which is my sanctuary. When the world gets too heavy, that's my place to go.
Were there any projects during elementary or middle school that really sparked that interest?
You know, I can't think of any, other than ones I created myself. No other project.
Yes. Would you mind providing an example of a project you created yourself?
Yeah. I didn't know tree identification from bark in the winter when there's no leaves on it. If there's leaves on the tree, I knew what the tree was. So I took a section of the woods that's separated. I have two 16.3 acre woods that are separated by about a quarter of a mile to a half a mile. And the backwoods I don't very often get used to because I have to transgress somebody else's property even though I have an easement. And so when I went back there, I thought, I'm going to learn how to identify those trees by their bark. And that's what I endeavor to do, and do pretty well at it still.
I know you continued this interest into college.
Oh, yes.
Were you involved in any projects or lab research?
Yeah, Bill, Dr. Hopp, had several things going. He was a parasitologist, and I've always found parasitology interesting to begin with. But he dealt primarily in amoebas and parasitic amoebas, like in Amoeba histolytica and doing the IMAX nana, and well, I could go on down the line. But that's where I was involved with him, where we collected all kinds of amoeba samples. And that's going through a lot of feces, because that's where you collect them.
Yes. For high school, when did you start and when did you finish at Greencastle?
I finished in 1956.
Yes.
So I started in, go back 4 years, whatever that is.
Yes.
This is 52, I guess.
Yes.
And went all the way through Greencastle. Loved them. I had some great teachers. One of them was my Latin teacher, who I had 4 years with her, Minnie Mae Bartley. An old maid, interesting woman, dedicated to her teaching. I also had a wonderful math teacher, Madonna O'Hare, who wore her hair curled and on top in a beehive. Red hair, dark, dark eyes, very tall stature. And one day she ended up catching their hair in the Venetian blinds as she was raising them, and off came the wig. She was totally bald. And you know, that class loved her so much. There wasn't a laugh, there wasn't a giggle as she went out of that room in tears because she was so embarrassed. And I thought, you know, what neat respect. Because normally that kind of a reaction with freshmen in high school would have been a little more tragic, I would have thought.
Yes.
But, yeah, I had some great teachers. In Greencastle, because I think of the influence of DePaul University, just had great teachers.
How was DePaul involved with your university?
A lot of student teachers. So DePaul was it's the only school around. They could place them in easily unless they wanted to really travel some distance to do their teaching. And so they were pretty heavily involved. I don't remember any one of the faculty members at DePaul that was involved per name, but we had just such great student teachers that they just kind of came and went, but they fit into the curriculum beautifully.
Yes. When did you start at Indiana State University?
1960.
Yes. What major did you pursue in undergraduate?
Oh, I was in pre-med all the way. I was going to be an MD no matter what. By the time I finished it was my junior year. Oh, this is kind of embarrassing. I was given a choice by my father whether to accept my mother or go on to med school or not be supported by him. And I decided that I wasn't going to play that kind of a game. So I put my whole senior year on breaks and said I better take some education classes so I can do some teaching at least until I decide if I'll ever want to go back to med school or get in med school. Teaching is addicting. If you enjoy it, if you enjoy people, it becomes a very addicting job. You know, it's, I wasn't in my teaching more than 3 weeks. I student taught at Garfield High School in Terre Haute under a good teacher. But that teacher was someone that was really interesting. He would call up to Indiana State and say, "Give me your best student teacher and I'll take them." And he would have them teach all of his classes. He would pull 5 or 6 students out working on their science fair projects so that they could come in first every year, and they did. But it was an interesting makeup because I had the class myself, and it was just like I'd started in teaching right away. And within a week or two, I thought, this is what I want to do the rest of my life.
Yes.
And I did.
What was that teacher's name?
You know, that's interesting. Like Garfield High School, I can't even think of his name. That's terrible. It's gone.
No worries. You had mentioned that involved in high school, you participated in some extracurriculars.
Yeah.
Would you mind elaborating on that?
Well, I was in the Latin club because of Minnie Mae Bartley. I was in the science club because of Joe Novak, who was the biology teacher at that time. I was in the physics club because I thought I might as well round out all of the sciences. There wasn't a chemistry club, thank God. So those were the things that I participated in the most.
Yes, and you had mentioned working with the parasitologist.
Yes.
What research did you do?
Amoeboids, all the amoeba groups, and particularly the amoeba groups in domestic animals. So we dealt with both cats and dogs and the whole bit. And you know, there's a lot more at that time, at least, because they didn't have the immunizations that they have currently now for pets. There was a lot more parasites, and some of them very lethal.
Yes, yes. And at Indiana State University, you went on to pursue your master's.
Yes, I did.
As well. Who was your advisor or a mentor?
Bill Hopp. I taught for 2 years, and began thinking, I've got to have more than a high school teacher's job to support my 3 little women, Meg, Jo, and Amy. Beth never arrived. And if you've read the book, The Little Women, they're named after the Little Women, and their personalities fit their people in the book. Whether that's our tailoring, my wife and myself, or whether it's just by chance, it's still there.
What's your wife's name?
Janice.
Janice.
We have the same initials. Hers is Janice Ruth, mine's John Richard, and so it's JRH.
Yes. You had mentioned also going to teach at Garfield. Were you involved in teaching anywhere else between your bachelor's or right after your master's?
No. I did my student teaching right into my high school teaching and taught at Highland 2 years, came back down to Indiana State, finished my master's, back up to Highland because they wanted me as not only a high school biology teacher, they wanted me to be a science supervisor, K-12 in the system. So there was a program that the American Association for the Advancement of Science had developed for elementary teachers to get them to feel much more comfortable with science and doing science things. It was called Science, a Process Approach. And I went out to Philadelphia and took a workshop for 3 weeks on that curriculum. Came back, taught the same workshop to all of my teachers in the elementary schools and implemented that K through 6. And that became a very successful program. I was just really pleased with it. And by the time I got the kids then in high school, I had kids that knew what process education was all about. They knew how to observe, how to infer, how to predict, how to classify, how to communicate, how to, just the processes that are really indigenous to science.
Yes. When did you start teaching at Highland?
1960. That was my right after I graduated as an undergraduate. Yeah, 1960. Taught 60 and 61, so I taught 2 years, and then went back down for my master's, finished my master's in 64, and back up to Highland again as a science supervisor, K-12.
What were your responsibilities as a science supervisor?
Highland is a system that has one large junior high, one large senior high, and at that time 7 elementary schools. And I first started out with the elementary teachers in each one of the schools. And so they wouldn't have to move at the end of a day and come out to one large group. I would take the workshop to the ones at the schools. And so after I got all of the elementary schools taken care of, I then went to the junior high and senior highs. It was a year and a half long process, but by the time it was going, it was really heady, and has been recognized as a model program.
Did you have any particular impactful experiences while student teaching at Highland, or teaching at Highland?
Oh, yes, good Lord. Highland is a bedroom community. About 98% of the student body have at least one or both parents as college alums. So it's a highly educated community. I didn't know that when I first started teaching there, but these kids are sharp as tacks, and you get responses from some of them you just can't forget. There's a little kid in my freshman biology class, his name was Joe Uhas. And I asked Joe, I said, Joe, what's the function of the vagus nerve? And he looks at me and says, I haven't got the vaguest idea. There were comments that would come back like that you just think, oh, Lord, I hope myself for that one. But they were good kids. Yeah, I had a lot of wonderful experiences. I had some that were just absolutely hilarious. But I do not care to put on tape right now.
And you went on to pursue a graduate teaching fellowship at Indiana State University.
Mm-hmm.
What prompted you to move to that teaching fellowship?
I looked at my daughters and I thought, I've got to have more than just my undergraduate. I've got to do much more. And I wanted to make sure that I went on and got a doctorate somewhere. But Bill, Dr. Hopp, said, why don't you come back and we'll set you up with a good master's program. And he did. And there was a faculty member here at Ball State that set me up on my doctoral program. Did you know Dr. Membalou?
Yes, yes. Mildred? Or
Yes.
Yes, Mildred Ballou, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Mim and I sat on the State Science Advisory Committee for the Department of Public Instruction for about 4 years together. And we often would ride together, drive and share a ride. And she kept saying, you just got to come down to Ball State and we'll tailor-make a program for you in your doctoral program. And I said, yeah, when I have time, that sounds really good. Well, it came a day that I looked at my daughters and I thought, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And so that's how I ended up at Ball State. No intention of staying here after I finished my doctorate, none whatsoever. But I had a $190,000 NSF grant for teacher training along with Dr. Mertens, God rest his soul, a great colleague. I had him as a friend, scholar, and colleague for about 22 years before he passed. And still miss him.
Yes. When you were pursuing your master's and graduate teaching fellowship at Indiana State, what did you pursue your master's thesis about?
My master's thesis was a protozoology thesis, primarily because I was working with Bill. And we were doing a survey of a ditch that ran parallel to the high school, Highland High School, called Katy Ditch. And it was very polluted. And it ran right through the backyards of housing in the community. And the community really hadn't done anything about it. There was just raw sewage that was dumped in and all kinds of stuff. And so we did the survey so we could provide data to the town of Highland about Katy Ditch. And that's why we were involved in that. It worked out as a master's thesis for me and also as data for Highland, in which time they did clean up Katy.
I'm glad to hear.
Yeah.
Yes. And you had mentioned that Mildred was influential in getting you to come to Ball State and pursue your doctorate. Why did you choose Ball State?
Actually, it was the enticement of making a program that would be tailored to my needs rather than a program that you step and fit in. And she kept saying that, and by gosh, Mim was true to her word. She probably shouldn't say this, Mim, I know you're past, you may be looking down right now. But she would say, now this is who you want for this class, and this is who you want for that class. And that class is offered at 10 till 11 on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She pretty well tailored my curriculum for my first 2 years.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Was she your PhD advisor, or was there someone else?
No. My doctorate advisor was head of the science department at that time, head of the biology department at that time. And that's terrible. I can't think of his name.
Was it Jerry Nesbitt?
Yes, thank you. Jerry was a good man, quiet as could be. And the only time he opened his mouth was to give you some good corrective criticism. No praise, but a good corrective criticism. But he was a good mentor.
What classes did Mr. Nesbitt teach?
He taught methods, graduate methods. He also taught parasite. He also taught general zoo. So,
Yes.
yeah.
What did you pursue your PhD about?
My doctorate was primarily in process education. And it's not at the secondary level. I looked at the elementary teachers, and the teachers need to know how to teach process education, how to teach kids to observe, to infer, to predict, to classify, to control variables, the whole bit, defining, working at the higher processes, defining operationally, experimenting, and so on down the line. The elementary teachers had no preparation in that area at all, and many of them still don't today. And I saw that as a glaring need if we were going to produce kids that are inquisitive in junior high and high school and following science. We need to make sure they are captured in elementary, which is the fundamental ground. And so that's what I devoted my thesis to, and to a lot of my time as a supervisor.
Yes. You went on to continue teaching at Ball State. What made you make that decision besides the wonderful NSF grant?
Well, the NSF grant was very, very motivating. There's no doubt about that. But by that time, I'd started working with Dr. Thomas Mertens. As I said, he's passed. Tom was a geneticist in the biology department. And Jerry Nesbitt said, "You will work with Dr. Mertens in this NSF workshop that we have this summer." And since Jerry was leading my committee, I wasn't going to say, "No, I'm not." And so I ended up that first year working with Jerry and with Tom. And finally, Jerry Nesbitt just sort of moved out, and I took his position as parallel with Tom, teaching in the NSF workshops, writing an NSF grant again that summer, and it was funded highly. And in fact, I believe there were 7 or 8 NSF grants that we wrote that were funded. We were teaching right side by side all the way through. And the last one was a 3-year grant, which NSF doesn't give, but they gave it to us, which was interesting because we had such great assessment data of the impact. And I designed that, and Tom went along with me. We gave the high school teachers pre-tests and post-tests at our workshop to see what they had gained during the workshop. And they in turn gave free tests, post-tests to their students. So I had tons of data. In fact, I hate punch cards to this day because we had, at that time, we didn't have near the analytical ability we have now. But it was fun, and I had just massive amounts of data about the impact of the workshop and what happened with the kids. And I was pretty sure that human genetics was going to make a big, big impact on human health. And I was sure enough that I thought, we better make sure these kids are well grounded in that at the high school level so they can pass some of those thoughts on to the kids that they're teaching, because it has. There's just no doubt about it. When you have the ability now to program genes, to change the genetic makeup of a human being before it is born, you have power, and power that needs to be wielded with some ethical background, that's for sure.
Yes. You started as an adjunct methods instructor as well as a doctoral fellow.
That's right.
What were your first classes teaching here at Ball State?
First classes I taught here, I taught elementary methods. That's because nobody in the biology department wanted to teach it, including the current person who was teaching it, and I will not mention names. And I loved it. They were just good kids. Excuse me. They were not kids. They were young adults. But I did love it. They were scared, absolutely scared to death of science. 90% of elementary students don't want anything to do with science. But when I showed them what they could do without really being what they perceive science to be, which it's not, they perceive it to be memorize and regurgitate. But process education is totally different. How do you observe something? What are you looking for? Is it safe to taste? How many senses did you use in making that observation? Does you feel it? Did you smell it? Did you taste it? Did you describe it? Did you measure it? So on down the line. And the elementary teachers began to see that what they were teaching outside of science was applicable to science, as well as to the science being applicable to what they were teaching. And it worked out very well. It worked out very well. Once the teachers began to see that, and I'd already had that experience in Highland with the high school teacher, or the grade school teachers there, and I knew I could do that here, and it worked.
Yes. Later in your career teaching, you had established the Human Genetics and Bioethics Laboratory. Yes. Would you mind elaborating on how that came to be?
No, I'd be glad to. When Tom and I were writing grants together, I said we need to label what we're doing. And because it was a unique combination, H.G. Abel was born. It's the Human Genetics and Bioethics Education Laboratory. And H.G. Abel began to be used synonymously around the country. And as we trained teachers in the summer workshops, I believe we have all but 3 states that are represented in teachers that we had from around the country, including Alaska and Hawaii. Those were nice follow-up visits, by the way, because during the year, academic year, I followed up with 25% of the people we taught in the summer. And that's a joy to see your work being translated and implemented, that's for sure.
Yes. What year did you come to Ball State for your doctorate?
1971.
Yes. When did the Human Genetics and Bioethical Education Laboratory come into being?
Ooh. 73.
Yes.
Yeah. Man, I can't believe that. That long ago.
Yes. In coming to Ball State for your doctorate, was there any influence about research possibly going on here at Ball State? Or you had mentioned Mildred as being one of the influential...
You'd have to know Mildred. She was probably the most persuasive lady I've ever met in my life. And that does not indicate that my wife's not persuasive. However, Mildred was very persuasive, I'll tell you. And she was right. You know, I look back, God bless her, and think that she did me a great service. I'm not really sure that I would have ended up at Ball State if it hadn't been for Bev. But you know, she was the one that introduced me to Jerry Nesbitt, and she had already talked heavily with Jerry Nesbitt before I ever met him, and saying, you know, you want this guy, blah 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 blah. So she sold me to him. It was a situation where once I visited campus and met people, the more I thought, yeah, this is someplace I want to be.
What struck you about Ball State and meeting people on campus?
Number one, the enthusiasm of the people that I met. Higher educations can be very stoic, stale places. This was not my experience, the people I met. They were enthusiastic about what they were teaching, about their students, and I thought, that's a place and an environment that I want to be in. And it wasn't just in the biology department. Dennis Redburn, God rest his soul, and higher education was on my committee. And over in TC, I found an awful lot of people like that. I don't know whether, does TC still have their coffee place on the top floor?
I believe so, yes.
That used to be a common meeting ground of faculty members in several departments, but I started going over there pretty regularly, and I really got to meet people from around the campus and saw just that the campus philosophy permeated the campus. It wasn't just in one locale, which was very interesting.
Speaking of faculty members, what role did Mildred play in the community? Was she a professor?
Oh, she was the head of the elementary education department. I mean, she had a very responsive position. And a self-taught scientist. She had a few science classes, but she really understood what science was about, particularly from an elementary basis for her students. She was an impeccable dresser. She and Phil both were taught. Her husband taught at Ball State as well, and TC. Right on top of everything. I love the lady. She was just a sweetheart.
Yes. In teaching at Ball State with the Human Genetics and Bioethics Laboratory, what work did you do inside Ball State for undergraduate students?
I taught some undergraduate methods. In fact, I taught a lot of those. And then I started teaching the graduate level secondary school methods. We had methods were divided into elementary teachers and secondary teachers, so we had different methods classes. So I taught both of the secondary and elementary methods for a while, and then I also taught 199, which was my introduction to the honor students. That was a human genetics and bioethical decision-making course that Warren Vanderhill had asked us to develop.
Would you mind elaborating on how that course came to be?
Yeah.
Honors 199?
I believe Warren called me rather than Tom first. I believe that's the case, but I wouldn't swear to it. One of us was contacted. And at that time, Warren said, look, he says, I've got a great humanities setup of teachers and faculty. I've got good history and English and the things I need. So I don't have any science classes at all for honor students. He said, would you guys be interested in developing a science class for the students? And I thought about it for a while, like about 20 seconds. I said, sure. And he said, well, what have you got in mind? And Tom looked at me, because we were sitting in Tom's office at the time and had the phone on speakerphone. And I said, I think a human genetics and bioethics course would be a good one, because Tom had taught human genetics. Because it would be of interest to all the honors kids, whether they were science majors or not, because when you talk about human genetics, we're talking about them. And bioethics, they love that kind of stuff anyhow, and so it was a natural. We teamed them both together, and I can't remember how many years we taught 199, but it was a lot of years, and a lot of good students.
Yes. I know this would have been one of the first courses for non-science majors in the Honors College. Why do you think it was important that non-science majors were exposed to this course?
Primarily because it's their life. If you look at what's happening in medicine and science today, genetics is the background. If you have that as a background, you can interpret it for yourself. You can help yourself to make the decisions you may be asked to make. And we did a lot of them. I mean, we did some pretty heavy stuff. When you can identify in utero a child that's going to be trisomy 21, Down syndrome, or you can identify one that's going to have Tay-Sachs and only live to about 4 at the most, and you can go down the line on those kinds of things. And they then begin to realize they have to make decisions on those. What if it were me? And, you know, I don't think I ever had an evaluation of all the years that I taught 199 that said they didn't like the course. It just dawned on me right now. You know, there were sometimes it was all right, but nobody said they didn't like the course in all those years. That's interesting.
Yes, you had mentioned the continuum exercise that you used for determining life or death for a prenatal child. Would you mind elaborating more on that activity?
Yeah, the decision-making process that I developed used a whole series. There's actually a response sheet that they can go through that starts out with stating the problem, what ought I do, when, and listing at least 4, preferably as many as 10 alternative solutions. Most people, when faced with a serious decision, one that has a lot of moral responsibility to it, think of the one answer that their morals fits the most and don't give themselves any other alternatives, which locks them in step to a situation which may not be favorable for them at all. So I wanted a model that would force them to look at alternatives first and then to rank those alternatives. Because later on, if they had a first-ranked alternative solution up here, as they were listing the consequences in another section of the model, if the consequences outweighed their preference to that, they had a second one they could go to and check to see if it fit. That's more of a rational decision-making process than most adults ever use today. But I've had students over the years that have written me on email. I mean, students 20 years back and then some, saying I had this situation in my family and I used the model, and it was such a godsend to me because it clarified what I ought to do, which makes you feel pretty good.
Yes. Are there any other prominent examples of activities or examples that you used in class of disorders or decision making?
Yeah, we developed several case studies, and the case studies went along with the decision-making model. The reason for that was I wanted some homogeneity of getting responses to take a look at where the kids were. So we had a case study on Downs, we had one on Tay-Sachs, we had one on XYY, we had, that's super male as they consider. We had one on Kleinfelder, which is XXY. I guess those are the major ones that we had. But those case studies then served as a basis for using the model because they had to put themselves in the position of the person in the case. And I think the students found that to be very relevant.
Yes. How did you gauge where students were?
Primarily by looking at the values that were expressed in their decision-making models. I read so many of those things I thought my eyeballs would fall out because I normally had 120 students, and that was 10 weeks. Until they went to the semester system, that class went by so fast, I thought, hi, goodbye. You know, it was just 10 weeks is nothing to try to develop the concepts I wanted to develop. So I was thankful when we went on the semester. Everybody else was, oh my God, I'm going to have to deal with them for all those weeks. And I thought it was great, and it worked out great for me.
Yes. How was it different for the undergraduate Human Genetics and Bioethics course compared to the honors course that you developed, the methods class and then the honors?
No difference. I feel very strongly that we have artificial dichotomies in education, and if you approach teaching right, you should be able to educate people from all realms and all ethnic backgrounds and all value backgrounds. You just got to find the keys that open those locks.
Yes. You had been involved in another oral history project for St. Francis Catholic Church here in
That's
Muncie.
right.
How did your religion impact your teaching?
That's a very good question. There were times that I had to bite my tongue from letting that happen. I did not want to impose any of my values on my students. Rather than that, I wanted to help them clarify their own so they had a rationale for their own. Some of the cases, when you dealt with abortion, for instance, I'm a Roman Catholic, as you well know, was pretty wild. And when a student asked me once, would you condone abortion? I said, yes, under certain circumstances. I thought they would croak right then and there because they'd seen me at Mass the day before. So I had to explain a little bit further. I said, you know, knowledge is a gift, and I look at it as a gift from a deity. And I think we're obligated to use it wisely. When we have the knowledge that a child in utero cannot survive and will take the mother's life if not aborted, I would support that abortion with no questions whatsoever. And I think that the students that were Catholic sitting in the class at that time began to understand me a little bit more. Your rigidity of thought can lead to an awful lot of problems. One has to be flexible. And it wasn't probably 2 hours after that, then Father Hammis gave me a call. Which was interesting. He and I went roundabouts a lot of times.
I know you had mentioned in your interview how several honors students had known what you had commented in class and went to speak with Father.
Oh yeah.
How did that impact your honors teaching?
Didn't. My faith is my faith. I can't say it didn't. But what it did do was make me more sensitive to students, more loving to students, more caring about them as human beings, rather than as a blob of protoplasm that's taking up space in a chair. And so I think my faith has always done that for me. I hope my students realize that I was leading them, not directing them. And I think most of them did. I think it's sufficient.
You bring up the issue of dichotomy between regular and honors undergraduate education. How would you address a question about elitism in honors education?
There's no place for it. The honor students on the campus, as far as I'm concerned, have shown their academic ability. They need to show their leadership ability. They need to take people with them on a walk, not stand ahead of them.
Yes. How did you encourage that in your classes?
Tried very hard to do that. In fact, I even brought in undergraduate students who were as pre-service teachers and say, you know, I'm going to give you a chance to teach this part of this class. And the students never knew that they were just regular undergraduate teachers majors. They just knew they were teachers majors, and they assumed they were honors when they weren't.
Yes. You mentioned how, with the bioethics course as well, that you had developed a test case study for PKU.
Yes.
Would you mind elaborating more on that activity? Was it involved in honors?
Yes. Yeah. Phenylketonuria is an inborn error of metabolism where the child cannot metabolize phenylpyruvic acid, and as a result ends up having liver damage, lung damage, and it can actually die if not treated. PKU is something that is on I think every one of the 50 state screening now in utero, not in utero, right after birth. And so we have a whole series. I don't know whether people realize it or not, but when I was teaching the human genetics, we had about 9 things that were checked for when a child was born. Homocystinuria, PKU, I can't remember all of them. But they were a rundown so we could know we could treat right away, because these were things we could treat and ameliorate the effects of the Barrett gene. And so PKU is definitely one of those. And I think that it was the first addition to the state screening law here in Indiana. If not the first, very close to. And so I incorporated it as soon as I found out about it, because I was on the State Science Advisory Committee, the Genetics Advisory Committee. Incorporated it right in 199 so that the kids there would understand. And sure enough, within, probably 2 months, one of the siblings had given birth to one of the kids in the honors and had definitely had the PKU test, and found out she had phenylketonuria. But that means we could make sure that the diet didn't contain the amino acid that causes the problem. And that's exactly how they treat it, was a special diet. No mental deterioration, the whole bit. And after about age 18, they could stop that diet, and the buildup of phenylketonuria acid in the bloodstream of that person would not affect the brain. So it was a win-win situation.
How did that case study impact honor students' decision-making skills?
I don't know whether it impacted or not. They had to use it on the model, and I think the model had the greatest impact on their decision-making skills, no matter what the case study was. If they found the case study relevant, I'm sure they worked harder on the model. That's where I tried, at least. I'm not sure I had succeeded all the way. I tried to make the case studies meaningful. So they were case studies that were patterned after my own experiences in working in medical genetics. I took a sabbatical and went down to Riley Hospital, and in the medical genetics there, my whole sabbatical was spent in Indianapolis, right there with Joe Christian and several of the other medical geneticists right in MedGen. And that was an experience and a half. I mean, it gave me the basis for teaching the rest of my teaching career. So I'm glad I did it fairly early. Now, as I look back on it, I would have done it much earlier.
Yes. Were there any other medical genetics experiences?
Yeah, one of the people that was on my advisory committee at Ball State as an adjunct faculty member is a medical geneticist from Fort Wayne. Pat Bader is her name, Dr. Patricia Bader. And I went up and did a clinical with her as well for a semester.
Yes. What year was your Riley Hospital sabbatical?
I'm really not sure. '71 and '72, I think. But I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look at my calendars. At my age, those years are beginning to blur a little bit. I've been retired 20 years.
You mentioned conducting medical genetics experiences. Were you involved in any research on campus?
Not here, but with Pat, yes.
Yes. What was Pat's last name?
Bader.
Bader.
B-A-D-E-R. I don't know whether Pat still comes down or not. She used to come down and consult with several of the pediatricians here in town. In fact, I haven't seen Pat in probably 15 years. So I have no idea whether she's retired now, but I have a feeling she might be.
Yes. You had mentioned your colleague, Tom Mertens.
Yes.
What was he involved in on campus in terms of research and teaching?
Tom was the most meticulous, well-organized teacher I've ever met. He wasn't dynamic, but boy, oh boy, he had it down to the dots and the periods and the commas and the hypotheses. He taught human genetics, taught regular genetics at Ball State for years, and worked with me for 18 years before he retired. The secretaries in the department said after Tom retired, he says it won't be long till John will be going. And they were right. A couple of years, I couldn't carry the whole load myself. I mean, I still wanted it to go on, but it didn't.
What did that load consist of?
Primarily the Honors 199 class, my own bioethical decision-making class, and a slew of honor students' theses and doctoral dissertations.
Would you please give an example of one of the honors theses?
I've got them all on my shelf in my office at home, every single one of them. Yeah, there was a young lady from the northern part of the state who decided she would do a survey as to how many medical geneticists were available for consultation and how many of the doctors in pediatrics that were referring some of their patients to medical geneticists. It was an excellent piece of work. She had developed a good survey and a good rationale introductory letter to the medical doctors and to the people. She says, I don't want people's names, I just want numbers. And we found out at that time, and that was in the early 70s, there wasn't very much going on. There wasn't the kinds of referrals, even though doctors knew that when they had a woman who was 41 years old and pregnant, that she had a high probability of having a child with trisomy 21, which most people call Down syndrome. And notice the way that said, a child with, not a Down syndrome child. There is a big, big difference. And I remember like it were yesterday, one of the students came up in my class in that awful room CN 188, which is a diagonal, holds 300 students. But I made them cloud up as front as far as they could, asking me, why do you do that? Why don't you say a Down syndrome child or a child with Down syndrome? I said, I don't want to label anybody. This child has Down syndrome. She's not a Down syndrome child. I said, there's a big difference in when you say those things, how you feel about those children. She caught on pretty quickly.
Yes, you had mentioned the diagonal room. Did you teach mostly in Cooper?
Yeah, CM 160. You were there, so you know the room I'm talking about.
Most definitely.
Oh God, I come in the bottom like you. I said I always felt like one of these days I'd like to come in with a cape, like Dracula, come in that bottom door. Because man, I'm telling you, that room is awesome. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of years teaching in that room.
Yes. Did you teach the honors course in that room as well?
Yes, I did.
Yes.
Yeah. At that time, there was no laboratory for the science course for honors, and no credit given. So I took a 3-hour course in human genetics, and I made it a 4-hour course. I made an hour lab mandatory on Thursdays. So I taught a lab from 8 o'clock on Thursdays till 5, every Thursday, because there are 24 students in the lab, to break them up into certain, so they could make it to one of those lab times. And developed a whole series of lab aptitudes. No budget, no financing for it in the department. So we cut out paper chromosomes, we did all kinds of things with pretty cheap situations, but it worked out well because it did teach the kids the concepts that I wanted them to learn. And you know, honors kids, I would say probably 95% of them plus, are not science oriented at all. They're humanities people for the most part. And they were scared to death of science. And you had to remove that fear first, because that fear can block learning very quickly. But it was fun.
Yes.
We did, what do they call those? Pipe cleaners? We did pipe cleaner chromosomes and all kinds of stuff.
How did you make science education approachable for honors students?
That's what I did. I humanized it. I made sure that they understand it's relevant to them. I said, you're either going to have kids, or you're going to be around kids, and you're going to see people that have genetic anomalies. You may wonder how. You may have some yourself. You may know how to deal with it. But the material is relevant to you, and you'll see it as we go through the course. And they did.
I know you had mentioned humanizing it. How did you approach issues of disabilities or controversial topics? I know you had mentioned abortion earlier.
Yeah, gee, I don't know whether he wants me to use him as an example or not. There's a student, wheelchair bound, with osteogenesis imperfecta, which is brittle bone disease. It was on the campus for a long time. And in my bioethical decision-making class, and I asked him, I said, I want you to do me a favor. And so he came in and taught the class one day. And students were absolutely amazed, because he ended up telling them at the end, he spent 15 minutes at the end of it. I have brittle bone disease. If I would get up out of this chair, I could break my leg just that quickly. And talked about the many breaks, because he'd been probably 300 plus breaks in his life already. And a great guy, just absolutely a great guy. But that humanized it, I swear to God. I took care of it right then and there for that class. And I wish I could have had him back for subsequent classes. But I ended up getting other volunteers to come in, but weren't as dramatic as Greg. Oops.
You had mentioned that student. Was he an honors student?
Yes, he was.
How did honors approach disability?
I never even brought it up. And neither did Greg. He was just with us. You know, I made sure he could get upstairs in the science building to the labs. We made sure he had an elevator key. And that was the only compensation I think that I gave him. Other than that, he was right with it.
Yes. You had mentioned the differences and trying to stay away from labels. How did that work with honors students and the label of honors?
That's a good question. I don't think I ever used the word honor student to them as a group. But I know that they were labeled by a lot of the kids, yeah, including my own daughter, who was an honor student at Ball State. In fact, the first day walking into class, from the bottom doorways that came in, before the stairwells, you know what I'm talking about, Amy was right ahead of me with her girlfriend, and another girl was right in front of her talking to her girlfriend and says, I understand his daughter's in class. Boy, what an easy A that's going to be. Amy turned around, tapped this lady on the shoulder and says, I'll have to work 3 times harder for my A than you will. So that was an interesting experience. There was only one of my 3 daughters I taught, but she did well. She did very well. She says, I had to.
What major was your daughter?
She was a psych major, social work as well. She currently is working for the state of Indiana as the head of the returnable possessions division. Has, I think, about 16 or 17 people under them that go through estates that have been left, no director for those states, no people listed in the family, to all kinds of stuff of that kind. Doing well. That's my baby. That's Amy of the Meg, Joe, and Amy.
Were the other two, were they honor students?
No. Well, yes, Meg was. Meg went here as a environmental major. I don't think she ever wrote her honors thesis. I don't think she graduated from the honors college. I can't remember for sure. And Joanne looked at me and said, "I'm not going to Ball State. I'm going to the University of Arizona." I said, "Do you realize what out-of-state fees cost on that?" She said, "Well, we'll be all right." She and her girlfriend from here went down to the University of Arizona. Her girlfriend lasted a year. Joanne graduated from there. It's hard to believe those years are going by that fast.
Where are they now?
Meg is in Indianapolis. Excuse me. Meg is in Daleville. Amy is in Indianapolis. Works where I said. Meg is an employment coordinator for the hospital system of St. John's. I can't remember. There's another name for it. Allegiance or something, where the several hospitals are merged together. And Joanne is the head of, what do they call that downtown? The Civic Center?
Yes.
She directs the Civic Center downtown.
Yes. You had mentioned that you also worked with high school educators, secondary school educators,
Yes.
in a workshop with Tom Mertens. Would you mind elaborating on that as well?
Yeah. Tom said that the things that he'd watched me do and learning about evaluation, organization of a class, concept development was something that secondary school biology teachers needed, because he was sure, as his own experiences dictated, that it was memorize, regurgitate. You know, can you name the 10 phyla? Can you name the classes in each phyla? Can you give me an example of a dinoflagellate? You know, those kinds of things were what biology was for years. It didn't have a process to it, that they saw at least. So we developed a methods course that used process education, that they had to observe, they had to infer, they had to classify, they had to communicate, both with graphs and otherwise. They had to use numbers, they had to feel comfortable with data. Physics and chemistry feel very comfortable with math. Biology people don't. It's just an axiom. I don't know why, but it's there.
Yes.
So we worked on those kinds of things in a 4-week summer institute funded by NSF. So these teachers were paid to go back to school. Their tuition was all taken care of. They got, they got a lot of perks. And most of them, because of the requirements of the state of Indiana, were seeking a master's degree, which they have to have a permanent license in the state. So it was a win-win situation for them and us as well. And I enjoyed working with them.
Yes. There were many teaching majors in the Honors College as well.
Oh, yes.
How did you impact them in your honors course?
I didn't try to single them out, number one. And so their impact, I am learning, or I had learned, from their interaction with me after the class was over with. Telling me, hey, I got some neat teaching ideas from your class, or this workshop was really neat. The laboratory was different than I had in high school, which was more cookbook. This was really investigative, and so on down the line. So it was by example more than by deliberate intention.
You had mentioned the laboratory. What activities did you complete in the laboratory?
Oh, Lordy. We had a whole series. We only had an hour because that's, as I said, it was a 3-hour class. I would have loved to have made it a 2-hour lab, but no money, no finances. So we did paper cutouts of chromosomes and made pedigrees, karyotypes they call them. Did karyotypes to see, you had a translocation here in T3 and so on down the line, so that they could begin to take a look at karyotypes. Then I would show them regular pictures of true karyotypes. I took, Pat Bader introduced me to a couple of volumes of books that had just great pictures of karyotypes of anomalies. And I photocopied those, probably against copyright law, considering how many I did. But we won't say anything now because that's been 20 years ago, and I'm sure I've served my sentence since then. But it really worked out well. We did the karyotypes labs. We did labs on tasting PKU. We did, let's see, I can't remember all the labs. But we developed labs that were 1 hour in length and really did some good. And I also used some of those lab times for some audiovisual presentations, which I found to be excellent, that I couldn't work in the class time, but I could have a solid hour of them in the lab. And there was, from the National Association of Human Genetics, had some wonderful films that if I was going to explain translocation, I couldn't have done it any better because they had the pictures there. They could show the situation. They could show when they stained the chromosomes where the break had occurred and where the piece had gone over to another chromosome and so on down the line. Just those kinds of things were used. So that lab was a catch-all for a lot of stuff.
You had mentioned for your honors class how you brought in some material from the PBS TV series Hard Choices.
Mm-hmm.
What was that series about and how did you incorporate it in your class?
It was a bioethics class. The whole series on Hard Choices was the bioethics. And they had a couple of small vignettes that I used. I took out of the films themselves. And then I got the idea of doing the case studies. And then I got the idea if they're doing the case studies, they're going to make some decisions with them. And that led to the decision-making model, which is pretty laborious, but at the same time, once the kids started using it, they went through it pretty fast because what it did is give them a structured approach to making a critical decision. If you don't have that, you're out in limbo all over the place.
What did testing or examinations look like for the Honors 199 class?
Every week they had a 10-item question that was built around the performance objectives for that week. Do you know what I mean by a performance objective?
Could you clarify?
By the end of this hour, you should be able to write your name in cursive. Okay, there's an example. Telling you a time limit, telling you what you're going to be able to do. And so all the objectives in 199 were performance objectives. You'll be able to build a karyotype. You'll be able to define a di-hybrid cross. You'll be able to show an example of a recessive gene, and so on down the line. Each of those kinds of objectives, the student could look at and say, this is what I'm expected to learn this week. And that's the way education ought to be, not keeping the kids guessing what the heck they were supposed to be learning, which is in about 90% of the classes that I've observed. Now that's a biased opinion, but the kids seem to enjoy it. Excuse me, my students seem to enjoy it. From being an old high school biology teacher, all my honors students were kids, and it just slipped out every once in a while. I had several of them tell me, well, I'm not a kid, Dr. Hendrix, please. And they were right.
You had mentioned your high school teaching. How did that impact your college teaching?
Taught me how to teach first. I don't think teachers are trained well yet, even. And many of them are thrown into situations which they just had no understanding they were going to face when they went through teacher education. And I don't know what the dropout rate is from early teaching, but I would assume it's pretty high. What was your question again?
Yes, how did your high school teaching experience affect your college teaching?
Yeah. When I started teaching at the high school level, I thought I was teaching because I was teaching as I was taught. But I found out within the end of the first year that wasn't working. And I began thinking about the great teachers that I had had and what did they do. And I began mimicking them and things began to work.
What were some examples of teachers you mimicked?
Okay, Bill Hopp was one of them. You learn by doing, not by telling. At first, I really thought the guy was lazy. Well, look it up yourself. It's there. Check it out. Then come back to me. Whole different way of looking at education, totally. And then here it is, right in front of you. Memorize it and regurgitate it. If you have to sort your way through it, you're thinking about what you're doing, not memorizing. Because I guarantee you, your memory's only going to last so long. You might make it through a 12-week, 16-week semester so that you can pass the final exam. But give yourself another year after that and see how much you remember. But if you had to dig it out on yourself, you'll never forget it. Never.
Yes. You had mentioned how the Time magazine article from March 20th, 1989, The Gene Hunt, had impacted your teaching. You wrote a whole article about it.
Yeah, it was fascinating. The data that I got from that situation. Lord, how did you look that up? That's years ago. My God, that's 30 years ago.
Yes.
It impacted it because it put a framework about what I ought to be doing in that class. And I needed a framework because I had karyotypes over here. I had autosomal dominants, autosomal recessives. I had sex-linked genes, and I had all these concepts, but not organized around the human itself. And that's what that one did.
Yes. How did it impact your understanding of science for the public?
It didn't. But what it told me was that the public was very illiterate with regard to human genetics and how they impact their own bodies.
The article brought up the issue of providing too specific science information that you and Tom Mertens wrote. How did you approach that in your honors class?
Repeat that question again, would you please?
In the Gene Hunt article, it mentions how, in your article reviewing it, how they usually put too specific or too advanced information in there, chromosome or disease names or alterations. How did you approach it in a respectful but approachable way in your honors class?
Example first, label second. You just don't reverse that procedure. And yet I see that procedure reversed all over the place. If that example is something they can relate to, then the label will be meaningful. But picking the label first, you can't pick the example out because the label may not be expressive, like that one.
Yes.
I mean, it tells you a little bit, but doesn't tell you the whole tale.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes. You had mentioned also a little bit about one of your articles that dealt with your religious identity as well, about how Indiana clergy require bioethics and genetics education. Would you mind elaborating more on how that impacted your teaching?
I had a doctoral student who did a research of clergy in the state of Indiana about how much do they know about human genetics. Because I don't know what the percentage is, but I would infer that it's fairly high that when a couple has a child with a genetics problem, and if they're faith-oriented people, they're going to be going to their priest, to their rabbi, to their minister, and they're going to be saying, why God, why me, And if the clergy does not have the background enough to understand, they can't do anything other than say, I'm sorry. And so Gordon's paper and the article that occurred afterwards of it indicated that the clergy needed to have some workshops. And those were given. We developed a workshop, and Gordon did most of the teaching of those workshops. And it's helped a lot. And I still hear from a few of the people that still stand at the pulpit every once in a while about the need for their younger colleagues to be trained again. Because that field doubles every 3 years. So that means I've been retired 20, will be 21 years this May. Look how many, 7 doubles. It's just an avalanche. I can't keep up with the data. I used to try. I can't anymore. My old mind just doesn't take it. But there's that much that are there. And this means that all the genetic counselors that are working around the country need to be constantly updated every single year. Many of them spend a third of their time just in updating.
And from this opposite perspective, how do you think honors education prepares a student to be a genetic counselor?
Interesting. You'd have to define honors education.
More focused on humanities.
Okay. Humanities is very important as far as I'm concerned for genetic counseling. You have to understand the value systems of the people that you're working with, their ethnic backgrounds, the kinds of things that their culture is saying to them. Because we live in a multicultural society, and you can't just think about educating one culture and not explaining what the rest of the cultures are like. So I think a good training program for a genetic counselor is a multi-ethnic program where they deal with practicums, with the Latino community, with the variety of communities that we have, with the black population who are very sensitive to the genetics, very sensitive. We just need a lot more open education and a lot more dialogue between the walls that we have built that separate us.
How does honors approach those walls? How did you approach them in your class?
Didn't have the walls. The honor students are all homogeneous. They're all white, upper middle class, females and males. Sorry, at least that was my experience when teaching them.
How did that impact your class?
I did not have, in the years that I taught, 199, a black student. Not one. I don't know, are there black students in the Honors College now?
Yes, the Honors College is expanding its diversity campaign.
Very good.
Yes.
Very good, because it needed it. It needed it. I mean, the whole ethnic group was being left out. I think that I could count on one hand the number of Jewish students I had in the honors program. And yet, out east, the reverse is true. They would be counting how many Protestants they have in their group.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting when the honors teachers would meet at various conventions. And I go to the NABT, it was every year. It's National Association of Biology Teachers. And the honors teachers that taught honors classes would have a coffee and a breakfast in the morning. There were about 14 of us on a regular basis that would share experiences and knew each other and would communicate through the internet, which was godsend to all of us. So it was fun.
Yes. Would you say that the demographic you had mentioned is specific to the Honors College or to Ball State in general during that time?
I'd say probably to Ball State in general. I can't speak for all, but there were just very few people of color when I taught here. It was just very rare. I got some teachers, thank God. Sorry. I also taught at IU. I don't know whether you know that I did or not.
Yes. I was about to bring up. Would you mind elaborating on that?
When I was teaching at Highland, I was a science supervisor at K-12. And IU approached me and said, we need a methods class over at the Gary Extension. Would you teach it? And I thought, oh, I'd be working day and night then. But I took it, and I taught their honors class and their methods class for several years. One night a week for 4 hours. And those poor teachers, they've been teaching all day long, and then they go to a class for a night class for 4 hours. So I think I did everything besides juggle to try to hold their attention. But it was a good class. I'm laughing because I had a follow-up meeting with 6 of the classes over a 7-year period in the Gary school system and had all the Gary teachers that were in those classes for a workshop. And Gary, Indiana is primarily a black community. And the teachers that I had in there, I did not have at the workshop. They didn't know me from Adam. And when they filed into this big gymnasium, all loaded up with chairs of the kind that you used to eat off the table benches, 90% of them black, looking at little whitey standing in front of them and saying, you know, here's another white guy going to tell me what it's all about. Well, Beryl Sayers, God bless her, she was built like a barrel, about 5'2", probably weighed 300 pounds. Came to the back of the room. She saw I was up at the front of the room. Dr. Hendrix comes running up, kisses me on the cheek, lifts me up, and sets me back down. I could have walked on water with that group. I could have walked on water. It was an amazing experience, but one I'll never forget as long as I live.
Was she one of the
She was one of my honor.
educators?
Yeah, she was one of my honors. Well, she was one of my teachers in my methods class, and one of several blacks that I had in there. But Beryl was a character. I loved her dearly.
How is that experience teaching different from teaching at your earlier high school in Greenfield and
Greencastle, you mean?
yes, and Highland, yes.
Big difference. Difference between a white elitist community, a white agricultural community, and a black community. And all three of those have sets of values that are different. And if you don't learn those values as a teacher and know how to use those in your methodology, you'll never succeed with them. You'll never.
How would you bring Muncie into that mix with Ball State?
When I started teaching at Ball State, I realized that I had an amalgamation of those values, not a separation of those values that I'd had earlier. And therefore, I thought, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to reach all the students or not. I tried very diligently to make them lesson plans that would merge the concepts and give examples that would come from each of the core groups. I think it worked, but I'm really never sure. You know, I'm not sure even when the students come up and say, oh, this is a great class, blah, 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 you know, whether they were hoping that their A- would be an A or whatever the case.
You had mentioned earlier receiving some letters back from students in gratitude for their experience. Would you mind providing some examples?
Excuse me. Yeah, but I'm not going to use names because those are private communications. But I had letters from students that some of them go back 15, 20 years about how the course impacted their life, which were ones that were significant to me because the knowledge that they had learned about human genetics was something that played out in their life. They either had a child that was trisomy 21. I had one that had a Patau's child, a child that had trisomy 13. I had kids that had genetic diseases that I hadn't even heard of. I had to look up in my own books to find out what they were. And oftentimes they would write and share their stories. And some of them were so tragic that you read the letter and you cry. And others were, this helped prepare me for. And you think, thank you, Lord. Because I do believe He works through us.
Yes. And you've had a wonderful impact. Recognition, you've received the Case Carnegie Indiana Professor of the Year in 1998, as well as the NABT and NSTA Highest Teaching Award.
Yeah, I've been lucky.
Truly an esteemed career.
Thank you.
How would you reflect back on that teaching?
I loved every minute of it. If you don't love what you do, you can't succeed. You know, if you get into a situation where you're unhappy, you don't like it, get out of it. Your life's too short. I told you I was going to be a doctor, but the first 6 weeks of teaching, I knew that it wasn't going to be an MD. It was going to be a teacher. So I had to redo my standard of living. I wouldn't be driving a Ferrari, I'd have a Volkswagen. And I did.
Yes. You had mentioned how you transitioned from going to a doctor to a teacher. How did you approach teaching students that were going through the pre-med route here at Ball State?
As I would any other student. You know, if they wanted advice, I'd be glad to give it as much as possible. But I taught all my students with the same expectations. And they knew those expectations because they were given those sets of objectives. They knew where they were going. I knew how we were going to get there. And I'd find out whether we had arrived or not.
Yes. You had also mentioned how your modern issues had changed over time about genetics. How would you say, because this year, actually coming up next fall, the Honors College is reinstituting a new course on genetic ethics?
Interesting. Who's going to be teaching it, do you know?
It's still in the works for finalizing who will be the instructor, but I was curious about your thoughts on how teaching was different from then with the new genetic editing coming out in technology to today. And it'll also be an honors course.
Yeah. It's very changed. I mean, technology and knowledge keeps evolving what you have to do and what you don't have to do. Number one, you've got to make sure the basics of understanding of genetics, which haven't changed, need to be taught so they can entrap it. I mean, if they don't know how to do a dihybrid cross and what it means, they're not going to get anywhere currently what's going on in human genetics. And so you've got to look at a course with what are the criteria basics that they have to understand if they're going to move on with these things. And you make sure those are developed first, and then you continue on. And if they don't do it that way, they're going to fall flat on their gluteus maximus.
Yes. In your honors classes, how did you lay the framework of genetics knowledge?
Ended up, first of all, making sure they understood the objectives. The objectives tell them the framework.
Yes.
And if the objective says by the end of this week you should be able to do a dihybrid cross, get a dihybrid ratio, and understand when that ratio isn't achieved, what might be the cause of that. And those were, for a lot of the honor students, they had never been given that opportunity. They'd always been spoon-fed. Here's what you're going to learn. Now give it back to me. And so some of them had some rough times with that. And some of them didn't like it at all. I could tell they didn't like it because it was forcing them to do some work that they hadn't done before. They're quick memorizers and regurgitators, but thinking is a little different. I had a few of them tell me that too. Because one thing about honor students is they're highly verbal. And guess what? I was an honor student too.
Yes. Were you in the honors program at Indiana State University?
They didn't have one at that time, but we had a clique of groups that followed together, and they made sure that we traveled together in our courses and our humanities courses. And so it wasn't called an honors college, but it was built like the honors college here, really.
Yes. And you had mentioned going to some other conferences, the National Association for Biology Teachers.
Mm-hmm.
How does Ball State, from your experience with the honors program, compare to other honors programs you had engaged with?
About the same. As I told you, we had several biology teachers that came to the NABT conventions that taught honors biology. And we get together for coffee and what have you, usually on a Sunday morning during the convention, and share stories. And very similar. It's amazing. Students are students no matter where you are, as long as they come from the same kind of a culture. And so didn't learn much from them other than some good ideas for lesson plans. And I think we shared those quite a bit.
Yes. You had mentioned earlier and brought up again this idea of multiculturalism.
Mm-hmm.
How did honors education here at Ball State address that issue?
It didn't. It didn't. And I don't know whether it does even now. I occasionally will walk through the science building and take a look at what's going on in the classrooms. And I happen to know the person that's teaching the honors class right now. And it's different.
Dr. Olison?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes. How would you say his approach to teaching honors education is different from yours?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Yes, yes. How would you say that you addressed topics that were sensitive, including, you had mentioned abortion, but specifically death, euthanasia, some other difficulties with genetic editing?
Mm-hmm. Head on. Didn't hide it, went with it, you know. I started out with the abortion thing, but I also did in my bioethics class, death and dying, you know, all kinds of things, the situations. Big units on death and dying, and big units on behavioral control. So I didn't hide any of the issues. I brought them up as I saw them, and we tackled them together with the students.
Yes, yes. Were there any personal encounters with students that were curious about their religious beliefs in the framework of ethics?
I had a few Catholic students that would come to me because they would see me at Mass. And how can you teach abortion? How can you do this? How can you do that? And some of them even went to Father John Kiefer, who was here at the time, and you know what Hendrix is doing in that class? Kiefer would call me up and say, hey, come on.
Yes. You had mentioned your interactions with honors faculty. What were your recollections of honors program and honors college deans?
Good and wholesome. We used to go on the top of TC where they have I don't know whether they still have a coffee bar there or not, but we would meet on a fairly regular basis for a cup of coffee for about an hour and just discuss what's going on in honors. And Warren Vanderhill was just absolutely great. I mean, he started the honors college, as far as I understand. And because when he called me, he said, I've got all the humanities lined up, I need a science class. And he says, but remember, these are honest kids that are primarily humanities majors. You can't hit them with an advanced organic chemistry class. And I said, we won't. We'll develop a class that'll be relevant to them and yet understand the science principles. And that's what Tom and I did, or at least tried to do at least.
That raises the question, why genetics for the honors, of all honors science courses, why the topic of genetics?
Because it undergirds all of life. And we began thinking about it, it's undergirding their life as well. They may not realize it, but there's going to be a certain percentage of them that are going to be hit head on with some tragic genetic problems. You know, I'm a type 2 diabetic. It's genetic with me. My dad had diabetes. My brother died of diabetes. You know, you learn to control it, but if you've got the knowledge ahead of time, you can learn what you do in your life that can mediate, I'll get it out, the diagnosis. And so knowledge is power, all the way.
What is the power of education then compared to now?
I think it has the same degree of power, but it has to have the selectivity of what is taught. There's a lot of time that I think is wasted in some classrooms. It doesn't get down to the relative points or to the processes that students need. It may be that the topics even chosen are just because they're favorite topics of the teacher, rather than what the needs of the students are. And to be relevant, I think you have to be meeting student needs first.
You had brought up Dr. Vanderhill's eagerness to include an honors science course.
Mm-hmm.
Why did he feel it was important to have an honors science course?
He wanted the entire honors program to be a round out of good curriculum that would have the value structures that are taught in the humanities, the value structures that are taught in the sciences, the value structures that are taught in the arts, because I think he included that as well in his curriculum. And therefore what he wanted was to have an honor student that was well-rounded, not focused.
Yes. I was curious with your interactions with honors faculty. What were your interactions like with non-biology, non-science honors faculty?
Actually, I didn't have any time for those interactions. Seriously. You know, when you've got About 120 to 125 students going through every 10 weeks. You hardly had time to even learn their names. That's why I had the lab. One reason I broke them down from that big class to where I had 25 that I could get a seating chart and get names associated with faces. I even took pictures of them. I've got those charts at home. The seating charts are there with the pictures on them because it was just so hectic. And time flew on that situation. You had to make the best of the moments.
How did you make the class personal with so many students?
Actually, by choosing topics that relate to all of humanity, themselves included, and giving examples that they could relate to. You know, you don't give a Bengal tiger example when you can use a human and show a picture and say, you know, hey, one of you in this class is predicted to have a child that will have maple syrup urine disease. And that's why we have a test for all newborns here in Indiana. That list keeps on getting larger and larger. I just saw on television this week a new edition. I can't think what it was, but it was on the news. You might want to check back and take a look. That was added to the list of mandatory screenings.
Yes, you raised that problem of mandatory screening. How did you address the ethics of that in your honors class?
Well, we had a case study which dealt with mandatory screening, and the person had a religious conviction that was different from that situation. So that they didn't want the knowledge to be given out. It happened to be a Jewish family the way the situation was, and it dealt with Tay-Sachs. And Tay-Sachs is lethal. You know, it used to be 0 to 4 years max. Now I think we've got it probably up to 8.5 with the medications that we have nowadays, but it's still a lethal disease. So you had to deal with that. You dealt with the death and dying. You dealt with, you know, the hopes, the expectations. I want a baby, and boom, 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 boom. Yeah, but you're a carrier, and you're a carrier, or you'd never have this child. You're going to have more again? You want artificial insemination with some other male so that you don't have that probability? You know, how are you going to handle it? And so you go through all the alternatives. Again, that's Cieslik model. Boom, boom, boom. You got to list as many alternatives as you can possibly think of that are feasible, at least. And then sort out the values around those alternatives about which one you feel is the most compatible with your value.
Yes. You had mentioned decision-making in the honors course as well, and your biology experience. How were your interactions with other biology faculty?
That's a toughie. Tom and I had a very close relationship because we wrote grants together, we were funded together. We were probably the most in fact, not probably, I know, we were the most funded faculty members in the department for years. And people would say, well, gee, those education funds are easy to get a hold of. They're not. Not any more than the biology research funds. But, you know, we bring in grants for $150,000, $200,000, and so on down the line, where they were lucky if they could get a $5,000 grant to study the pea plant, you know? Just the way it is.
Yes. Over your entire career, you've written more than 100 articles, 5 books, and you've published several chapters.
Yeah.
Why did you stay at Ball State?
That's a good question.
I know you had mentioned you were approached by other institutions.
I felt comfortable at Ball State. You know, it takes probably 5 years to learn the secretary over in this department and that department. Of course, secretaries know everything. They can get you what you need, the information. And it takes about 5 years to become acclimatized to a university, to know who you can go to for information when you're writing a grant, when you're writing an article, going so on the line. And that was one reason I stayed. But secondly, my relationship with Tom Mertens and my relationship with Mim Ballou were both so strong that that I didn't even think about leaving. It wasn't a choice. I was happy with what I was doing. I was happy with who I was with and working with. and that was sufficient.
Yes. You've been a wonderful asset to Ball State.
Thank you.
Today, I was curious about your reflection on if the Honors College was to stop this science course, how would that affect honors education as a whole? How would that affect the students they are graduating?
To me, every honors student ought to have a background course in science, whether it's human genetics or some of the other sciences. I don't care, as long as it teaches the methodology of science, what the values of science are. You know, scientist never says I found truth. Only approximations of truth. I'm ready to change it tomorrow if I get new data. And that's not the way the humanities is. You know, 1976 is what 1976 was. But to begin thinking that way and to hold those same set of values, I would say that to remove science from the honors curriculum would bankrupt the curriculum, in my opinion.
Yes. You had mentioned earlier as well some of your experiences beyond honors in the community. How were you a member of the Muncie community as well as part of the Ball State one?
Quite a bit. As you well know, because you're in the same church that I am, for a long time I taught CCD classes. And then I was downtown at the High Street Methodist Church. They have a program they call Update Learning every year. And they wanted me to teach a bioethics class there. I ended up teaching 3 bioethics classes there over the period of several years. And those community interactions made a lot more contacts than I thought. Those led to addresses at churches, at various groups over the years. So it's been fun.
Yes. And on a little bit more of a sensitive topic, did you experience any anti-Catholic influences or experiences?
You know, I never have, and I never had, I never hid my faith at all. I'm a convert. I mean, I came back from a church camp when I was 15 years old and asked my mother, I said, would you like to go to my baptism? She says, well, you've already really been baptized. I said, I'm being baptized in the Catholic Church. She never said a thing against it, which God bless her.
Were there any faculty in biology or honors that were against your teaching?
Yes. Oh yeah. I had my enemies in the department. Enemies that I think were based on some jealousy about the fact that we were bringing in so many bucks and they couldn't get funded. Some of them were just, what's that course doing in the biology department? What's a bioethics course doing in the biology department? It should be in humanities somewhere, you know. So there were those, and there was just a few of them, but they were vocal. And I smiled, nodded my head, and thought, you're an ignorant ass, but I didn't say that. You cut that one out.
Bringing up that topic as well, to address those people who had concerns, why include a bioethics course in the biology department?
This place is needed. I mean, if the course is based on the ethical problems that are created by the application of the material, that's where it goes. No other place. Although it's my understanding that someone during that same time was teaching a class that was very similar in the humanities section. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I believe so.
Okay, because I can't remember, but someone said that there's a course that deals with a lot of bioethical principles.
Yes. Yes. That's what I was curious about as well, because there are many ethics courses in the philosophy department and religion as well. So I was curious how it was applicable with, especially with genetics counselors and pre-med students.
Very much so. You know, they all come in with their own set of values, their own set of beliefs about what's right and what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. But soon, as they begin practicing the profession, they realize that it's not black and white or either or. Sometimes it falls somewhere in between, and how do I make that decision? And if they're not trained to begin thinking that way, they're going to be in a mell of a hess before too long.
Yes. How do you think honors benefited from having this course implemented when it was, historically?
It's an interesting question. Historically, honors benefited by, first of all, having a science class in the curriculum. But secondly, they benefited by finding out that it wasn't too difficult to take a science class and help merge it with the principles of the humanities. So the combination of human genetics and bioethics began to be a real exercise of saying, look, I could probably take a physics class and do physics ethics, or a chemistry class and do chemistry ethics, and see how the humanities really ties in with the entire curriculum. So I think it was a link and a bridge.
Yes. During that time as well, there was an explosion of genetic editing tests and their popularization. How would you say that that influenced the rise of bioethics in society in America?
I'm not so sure it did. But I am sure that that influence affected some people pretty heavily, those people that were involved in the field. But there are an awful lot of people out there that are really genetically ignorant and bioethically ignorant as well, because they're just not getting the training. And those aren't just necessarily the people that are lay people in society. I'm talking about professionals that are somehow in the field, that are, have had a good medical genetics background and education, but don't even stop to think about the ethical implications of what they're doing, until they have a woman sitting across the table from them in a conference that's carrying a child that I know can't live. And she says, I can't have an abortion. My faith won't let me that. And I said, you realize very carefully that you have an 80% chance of dying carrying that child.
Yes.
Those are tough decisions. I've cried with patients. I've sat in conference rooms that were half the size of this, where you're almost knee to knee, and giving data to people that didn't want that data, where their husbands were sitting outside because they didn't want to know what was going on.
Yes.
Tough. But I value the clinical evaluation experiences that Pat Bader taught me and allowed me to have. They made my teaching so much more enriched.
Yes. And continuing with those experiences that enriched not only yourself but your honors students, how were you involved with other honors college deans, such as Bruce Meyer and Arno Wittig?
Arno and I knew each other and, communicated. Well, you better cut that out because I'm not going to feed you right now. Not as strong as I was with Warren, because Warren pulled me into the department. And so when Warren kind of bowed out and Arno came in and what have you, hi, how are you? And they knew of what the class was and what the reputation was, and they never bothered me and I never bothered them. So that was just about the relationship, really. Got together when we needed to get together, but that was it.
How would you describe your relationship with Dr. Warren Vanderhill?
Warren and I are good friends. He's a fine man with a critical mind and was a good leader, and I respected all three of those.
Yes. How did he impact his honors students?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask his honor students. But I'm sure, knowing the man that he is, I think greatly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. How do you think it impacts the honors college if they have never had a dean who is a science professor?
I don't think it'd be any different. I think someone that takes on that role of deanship in an honors college has an honors background, at least in some area. And there's a lot of similarities in making a humanities course an honors course, a science course an honors course. So I don't think it would be that much different.
Yes.
This guy's loaded with questions, isn't he?
So, coming closer to the end of the interview, I was curious about your reflection on things happening today. So, Ball State is expanding its honors college and growing, especially with diversity issues as well. What do you think the honors college is moving forward with genetics? If you were to propose a new course today about human genetics and bioethics, how would it be different?
Well, the core would be the same, but the new advances in some of the implications of those for humanity and decision making, like epigenesis, and dealing carefully with genetic alterations, particularly those things that we're capable of doing now with restriction endonucleases and ligases that can cut specific spots of chromosomes, put them back together, insert genes, CRISPR. All the stuff that's currently going on in genetics today carries some heavy ethical responsibilities. I think they ought to be taught so they're understood, but they ought to put them into examples to where the kids can say, I don't know whether my values fit that or not, or how I'm going to deal with that, and give them a chance to deal with it.
How would you compare the openness of students as well as the secondary school teachers you've interacted with from when you first began teaching to today, or to your retirement?
Well, to my experience was 20 years back. Terrible. You got coffee around here. And I would say that students have been about the same throughout the history. Naive, honor students, anxious, hopeful, grade worshipers. Real grade worshipers. I swear to God, I had students that argued over 1/10 of 1 point on exams. And the exams never measured anything that practical and that specific going. Well, why didn't you give me that full? I took off the 1 point because. Well, Dr. Hendrix.
How would you say that impacted the class?
Not very much.
Yes.
The students, I may be egotistical, but the students I think really enjoyed my class. And I enjoyed them very much. There was a few experiences that were hilarious and funny, like the Joe Uhas thing. But there was the other one where I had, in CN 160, this kid comes in with the baseball cap on backwards, the bill and back. And, there was 3 sections in that, so it was probably close to 75 students. And he was sitting up on the my right-hand side facing the class, about halfway up. And it was the second day of class. And of course, you don't wear hats inside of a classroom. So I started in with my dialogue, and I just walked up the steps. I just picked the hat up off his head, dropped it in his laps, never even looked at him, and went on. He never wore a hat again. Nor did anybody else in that class.
Yes. Looking back on your experiences with Honors 199 and your human genetics and bioethics education labs, do any specific experiences stand out to you for impacting yourself and your career development?
I've had probably 3 or 4 experiences that impacted me heavily after the class, where kids have contacted me. Kids, see, they're always my kids. Where these young adults have contacted me with really personal problems that they were able to work their way through due to the knowledge they gained in the class. And they would just call in to thank me. But those touched me the greatest.
Which group was the most important to you in honors education? Was it the students? Was it the faculty? Was it your fellow biology staff members?
Always students. Always students. That's what teaching's all about, in my opinion. It's always good to have good faculty, good colleagues, the whole bit. But your students really impact you.
Yes. Coming to a little bit of a conclusion, what does the Honors College mean to you here at Ball State?
Well, you realize I have been retired 20 years, so I don't know what the current Honors College is, but the college I experienced was a healthy amalgamation of people that cared. And I'm not so sure that you always get that in higher education. There are people that are there because they don't know what else to do with their lives. But this amalgamation of faculty were people that seem to really care about their students and their students seemed to really care about that. You know, and it was fun to work in that kind of a climate with those kind of people.
Yes. You had mentioned looking forward in what you had done. You are involved in a started business resolution.
Mm-hmm.
Would you mind discussing what that is and how you're involved?
Well, I was. I since have given that up. I'm getting too old. But resolution actually dealt with the bioethical decision-making coursework that I would teach at various locations. I was a consultant at community hospitals in Indianapolis, all the hospitals, and gave in-service on use of the decision-making model, because physicians really need that and nurses really need that. That kind of an experience is what I did with resolution. But I decided I didn't want a business. It wasn't my forte. And so it only lasted a couple of years, and I'd rather go out and give free workshops than to deal with all the rigmarole.
When was the resolution company founded?
I can't remember. Let's see, I retired. Probably around 78, 79, and lasted until about 81.
Was it influenced by anyone? Did you have a partner in the founding?
Tom Mertens worked with me on it.
Yes. Looking ahead towards the end of our interview, is there any lasting experience or memory just at your time here at Ball State that you take with you?
I have too many of them to even single it out as one. A lot of good memories, a lot of good people, a lot of wonderful students. I don't have any real negative feelings. You know, there's a lot of people that retire that can't say that. I have just no negative feelings. Jerry Nesbitt was a great role model. God rest his soul. But I had others too. Tom was a great role model for me in his stoic, meticulous nature. When we wrote grants, I'd start out dictating. He'd start, and he'd say, he'd change this word as we go on. You know, I'd start. In the beginning, he'd say at the commensurate. It was just about that way. But this is how we wrote all of our grant proposals. And we'd be doing that over the holidays, and most of the teachers were doing something else. But the only time we could get together and work solidly was during spring breaks and the whole bit. But we generated a lot of proposals during those times. Those are all good experiences. So I could say I was blessed with good colleagues, good students, and I have no regrets about Ball State at all.
Yes. Were there any other role models?
Mim, but she was a different role model altogether. She was, I don't know how to put it with her. She was an autocratic leader who got by with it. Does that make any sense? Because people loved her. She got by with you're going to do this. Yeah? And she did that to me. And I'm glad she did. You're going to work with Tom Mertens. Just that simple.
Yeah.
And you didn't question it. You did it. If you were going to be associated with Mim, you followed through that way. So good experiences.
Yeah.
This has been a good experience, by the way. Bring back a lot of memories. For this old man, that's pretty good.
Yes. Coming to the close of our interview, is there anything that I've not asked you or mentioned that you'd like to discuss?
No, I think you hit it all. You did a good interview.
With that, we'll bring our interview to an end. On behalf of the Ball State University Honors College Oral History Project, I want to thank you, Dr. Hendrix, for
welcome.
participating in our project.
You are welcome.